This is a picture that hangs on the wall of my parents' house in Norwalk, California. That guy there is now former South Korean President Kim Jong-sam, and that there is me greeting him and his wife on one of their diplomatic visits to America. It was a rare honor, to be sure, but at the time it was met with mixed feelings. For one, this was back when South Korea was going through an economic crisis so bad that Koreans were donating their family heirlooms to the government so they could be melted down into gold bars to refill the Korean national treasury. This was considered a great shame, and my dad, like many Korean people to this day, laid the blame solely on the feet of Kim Jong-sam. And since my dad hated Kim Jong-sam, so did I. After all, according to my dad, Kim Jong-sam had opposed South Korean progress every step of the way for his entire political career. He was one of the greatest political opponents of Park Chung-hee, the first South Korean president. He once laid flat on the breaking grounds for the Gyeongbu Expressway, the first major South Korean highway, to delay and protest its construction simply because it had been commissioned by Park Chung-hee and because he had sworn to oppose Park Chung-hee's policies regardless of what they were. Towards the end of Park Chung-hee's presidency, Kim Jong-sam even fled the country in order to escape political pressure. Clearly, this man was a coward. But one fateful day in middle school, I decided to read about South Korea's political history on my own. And I discovered that the South Korean economic crisis, which had been part of the larger Asian economic crisis at that time, had actually originated in Thailand, and that Kim Jong-sam was never really in a position to stop the crisis from ever occurring. I then learned that the construction of the Gyeongbu Expressway, while ultimately becoming one of South Korea's most important pieces of infrastructure to this day, had cost the lives of several hundred workers because of their lack of experience in landscaping with explosive ordnance, meaning that Kim Jong-sam did have some legitimacy in his opposition to its construction. Also, it turns out that my dad's beloved Park Chung-hee was less of a president than he was a militant dictator. Yes, his hostile takeover of the Korean presidency was ultimately to be credited with the rapid South Korean recovery from the Korean War, but it doesn't really excuse all of his massive human rights violations, the most dramatic of which was blackbagging people in the middle of the night for simply speaking out against him, and then dismantling all political opposition to him. Speaking of which, Kim Jong-sam fleeing the country? Turns out it was more like Park Chung-hee stripping him of his political power than exiling him to America. So yeah, there was more to the story than my dad had led me to believe. All of this is to say, I'm not sure what's true. It doesn't help that much of the historical documentation, especially during the era of Park Chung-hee, is pretty biased at least, completely missing at worst. It's the reason I don't have much footage to show you other than stock American videos and a few choicely preserved pictures. The only thing I am sure about was that doing this research on South Korea in my middle school's computer lab all those years ago is the first memory I have of realizing that my dad could be profoundly wrong. Yes, there is some credence to my dad's interpretation of the facts since he did previously live in South Korea while I had not. But my dad had immigrated to the United States before he was 10 years old. Before that, he had grown up in a Park Chung-hee-controlled South Korea, and the seeds of his political opinions had likely been formed from the government-controlled newspapers at the time, along with those of his grandfather, whom I've never met. All things considered, my dad's opinions on South Korean politics are, at the very least, skewed towards a certain viewpoint. Things are changing, though. My dad recently told me that the internet taught him how to love. I talked to him at length about what he meant by this, and what I ultimately gathered was that the internet, for the first time in his life, allowed him to freely access viewpoints which, while in opposition to what he had always believed, at least seemed rational and logical, so it was often difficult to dismiss outright. He's grown to realize that he doesn't have all the facts. Neither do I. To this day, I'm still not sure what to make of South Korean politics or whose side I should really take when the topic comes up. In fact, I barely even remember meeting Kim Jong-sam in the first place. So much of my self-opinion as a Korean American is derived from these anecdotes and discussions I have with my father, and while they're always interesting, they always seem to bring up more questions and contradictions than clear answers. If anything, it bears further investigation.